And 90% of the things that learning and development should be doing, if not more, should be around whatever the mission statement says in the organization.
Welcome to the Stay Hungry podcast, the podcast that delves into human-centric learning and how to build and sustain a learning organization where a growth mindset is the foundation. This podcast is for HR, L&D, and business leaders looking to foster growth and drive meaningful change within an organization. In each episode, we engage in conversations with leading experts, innovators, and thought leaders who share their insights and strategies for creating a culture of continuous learning and development. Today, we're diving into a topic that is crucial for every L&D leader out there: how to actually measure the impact of learning in your company. And who better talk to about this than our guest, Ajay Pangarkar. He's an award-winning performance strategist, a leading LinkedIn learning instructor, and the author of the book, Learning Metrics, How to Measure the Impact of Organizational Learning. I'm Marcus Almén, your host, and let's kickstart this episode right away with our amazing guest. Hi, Ajay. Welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here. Tell me a little bit about how you got into L&D and also tell us a little bit about your background.
Marcus, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. Always a privilege to be on anybody's podcast and talk about this stuff. So I do appreciate it. A little bit about me. I always hate talking about myself because I usually go on too long about it, but I'll make it brief. So my experience in L&D actually came by accident. I think like a lot of people of a certain generation in learning and development, we sort of fall backwards into this. Initially, I went to an engineering program, didn't like that. And so in short, I went back to school to do a finance degree, believed that I needed to complement that with something. So I went to do a graduate degree in accounting. And the purpose was to move into that realm of finance and accounting. And so I had to think through what I wanted to do in life, and I started my own company. And the company was actually involved into small business training. And I was going to train in business topics, something that I really enjoyed. And that's sort of how I got into training. I sort of fell backwards into it. But along that journey, I discovered that I really had a passion for learning. And so as I got into the learning space, I said, how do I make sure people in L&D can show accountability for their work? And hence, 25 plus years later, here I am after 4 books, and the latest one called Learning Metrics, as we're talking about today, speak to exactly that, how to make learning truly accountable to business, not only business, but the operations within the business, and make sure that works.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that and your new book. In Learning Metrics, you obviously talk about how learning only becomes truly impactful when it's aligned with the strategy goals, right?
Yeah.
For many organizations, L&D is still viewed as maybe a support function or rather than a driver of growth and performance. And let's start by discussing how L&D leaders can make learning business critical and ensure that it directly contributes to the organizational success.
You know, I'm going to give a little bit of context and history, and I hope I don't bore your listeners too much here, but there was a time that I would say, and I say this with all love and respect, L&D, but it's not going to come across that way. So I just want to qualify what I'm about to say. Learning and development for the longest time, was seen as a bit of a spoiled child of the business world, meaning that the business leaders didn't really understand it, but they didn't really see the relevance. And so they would dump a bunch of money into a learning and development side we used to call just training. And it was meant to ensure that their employees were either onboarded properly, could do their jobs, or meet compliance requirements, right? As time rolls on, though, we live in a world that's exceptionally competitive. And there's no industry today and no company today doesn't live in fear of constant change, okay? And with change comes continuous learning. So today we live in a world where organizations see learning, and ones that actually truly take their role seriously in being successful, see learning as a priority, because as things change continuously, their people need to adapt and evolve. Adapt and evolve means learning. And so for them, and I know a lot of people are going to shrug their shoulders what I'm about to say, they see learning as a priority. For most senior leaders, and I'm not joking here, for most senior learning is in the top 5 priorities of the organization. So the question is, as you put it, Marcus, how do we make this accountable? How do we align appropriately to the needs of the organization? And there needs, where the accountability lies is that we have to focus on the areas that are important to the organization. When you focus on those areas, guess what? You are focusing on areas that drive organization growth and success. So if we're focusing on the right areas, and 90% of the things that learning and development should be doing, if not more, should be around whatever the mission statement says in the organization. And so if you are lost as an L&D person and don't know where to start, and not sure where the priorities of your organization are, look at the mission statement and the vision statement. Everything in that statement of your organization drives to what it is expected to do and succeed at. And so when you break down the mission statement into its operational components, you see where your senior leaders are placing emphasis, and the money and the budgets are allocated to those areas. And once you do that, you now can focus on those areas that need your support, right? You do your magic, you do your analysis, your needs assessment, and find out where they are lacking in support and performance, and how are they adapting to change. And once you find those weak areas, now you become their partner. And now you can help them become stronger in their operationalization of their meeting their expectations, their performance expectations. And that's where, and in short, that's where learning drives value. Hopefully I made that a little more concise. Marcus, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, definitely. So basically, from this perspective, you can identify the knowledge gap in the organization, and then bring them to the table to understand where you can bring the value from learning in.
Exactly. That's and really, and I can give, we spoke before, and I've given examples, and I can give examples today. And again, I have no vested interest in any of the companies that I share with you. But when we look at the leading organizations in the world, and people go to like the Apples and the Googles and all the high tech companies, but park those aside. Let's look at the traditional companies like a Toyota or Starbucks. Ask yourself what positioned them to be so good at what they do. Companies don't become good by accident. They become good because they invest in the knowledge in the right areas of the organization. And they place a lot of emphasis on the knowledge. So I'll park Toyota. I think that's a pretty obvious example, but let's go to Starbucks. Next time, I always say this to people, next time you're in a Starbucks line, anywhere in the world, and you're ordering a coffee, any type of coffee off their menu, keep in mind that coffee menu is already a customized coffee menu. It's already specialized. Furthermore, you or the person in front of you decides to further customize a already semi-customized coffee. And each time they do, it's pretty consistent. Now you ask yourself, how does that happen within 3 to 5 minutes that you get your coffee? It happens because each of those baristas in the back know how to do, what to do, when to do, to make that coffee successful, to make you a satisfied customer, right? Now drill back. Well, what does it take to make sure those baristas are skilled enough? Well, it takes equipment and processes, of course. That's, a given in any organization. But it also takes knowledge, right? You can't put Ajay behind there and say he's a barista because and just hire him because he makes coffee at home and he thinks he can make coffee at Starbucks. It's not going to work, right? Each time Ajay makes a coffee, I'm talking to myself in the third person here, but each time I make a coffee, if I was a barista at Starbucks and I'm not adequately equipped with the knowledge required, I'm going to screw up Starbucks, right? Or at least that location. And people are going to be very unhappy and not come back. So underlying it all is that knowledge that drives the organization. It's fully integrated into the culture and the fabric of the organization.
Interesting. So you mentioned before also that it's crucial for employees to feel personally invested in their own development.
Yeah.
And when learners are motivated, they're not only supporting their own growth, but also the success of the business. And I'm curious about how we can make sure that the personal engagement and learning translates into actual business value, meaning the learner also benefits from the process as well. What's your take on that?
Well, I'll be a shameless plug here. I've done a lot of courses with LinkedIn. It's called Getting Stakeholder Buy-in for Learning. And I always tell that people always think when we say stakeholders, we envision the senior group of the organization. It's what we call the C-suite of the organization, and even possibly mid-level management. And we always think management as stakeholders, but we often forget there's one very important stakeholder that'll make your learning, successful or fail. And we all know this, but we tend to ignore it. The stakeholders are the employees. And so going back to simple psychology, and I'm nowhere trained in psychology, by the way. I know finance and accounting very well, but ask me psychology, I just know some of the basic stuff. But I know this. In essence, it's about the what's in it for me, right? And that there should be some rewards for them, because to do that, they have to be incentivized in some way. And it's not always just money, right? Money is a temporary motivator, as we've all read in our management textbooks. But in the long term, it's about this self-fulfilling element that you need to get people to buy into. So I always talk about marketing as a push and pull. And if anybody studied marketing, you know what I'm talking about. A push marketing is you force people to, you just ram that message down their throats basically, and hopefully they buy. And, but that's push marketing. We're just forcing it on the people about the product or services. But the more effective way is what we call pull marketing. Pull marketing is when we get the buyer to engage and say, "Whoa, that's interesting. Tell me more, and I want more." Right? To pull it from you. And once they do that, they have a vested interest in wanting to buy the product. Now, take that analogy, put it into learning. For the last 50, 60 years, we've been doing push training. We've been shoving training down people's throats that you have to learn this, you have to learn this. And people say, "Okay, yeah, I have to learn it," but and then they forget it and they don't care anymore. And that's where learning fails, right? But those who do pull learning is what would get that employee to buy into my learning? What would get them to say, "Yes, I want that. I want to learn that. I need more of that," right? That's pull learning. So when you get them to pull learning, it means you get them involved in the design and the development of the learning. You actually go up to them and say, "What do you believe is the weaknesses in your role or your jobs? What do you believe can make you stronger in what you do? What do you believe can improve your performance to help you succeed in your job?" Whether the success for them is to get a promotion or to get more pay or whatever it may be. But what is it that will help you feel more fulfilled in that role, that will improve the job, that would make you look better, right? People want to look good. They don't want to look bad. And once you get that feedback from them, right, you design that into the learning, because now you've got them vested into your learning. So your learning technically can't fail. Well, I won't say can't, but the failure rate is minimized significantly. And they will buy into it and they will champion it, and they will retain the information and they will apply the information because they felt they were part of the process. They were part of the journey with you. And with that, makes them better, productive employees. Now, it's easier said than done, but really the simple step is stop sitting in your cubicle designing training by yourself, thinking you believe what they want, and actually go talk to the people and find out what they actually want and what to improve. Okay, that's part of your needs assessment process. If you want to be proactive, rather than sit there and wait and design something, go out and talk to them. Be proactive. Become a partner to that department. Become a partner to those people. Make sure that you are behind them 100%, even post-training. Most importantly, show them the supports and the lifesavers that they can reach for if they feel that they're sinking and they forgot something, right? Whether it be quick tutorials or quick access to, the knowledge cards or anything like that they can access immediately, but they feel that they're well supported by you. And granted, once you do that, you're going to have a group of employees that are going to champion your training, and they're going to speak. Guess what? It goes up the food chain, right? They're going to speak to their boss and say, "Wow, that was great. I really enjoyed that training. Give me some more, or get me involved in some way, some more." And that's going to go up the food chain, and people at the senior level are going to say, "Okay, why aren't we investing more in learning?" Right? But in short, that's really what it is. It's about getting people to be invested in what they do, right? And rather than dictated. I don't know if anybody remember as a kid when your parents told you to do something, you weren't happy. But when they sort of talked to you and said, I have a niece that I help raise, and when I used to tell her to do something, she would fight me. But when we would sit down together and decide how to do something together, she was all in, right? So I'm not saying employees are children. I'm just saying human beings like to be invested in a process.
I think that's very wise, and it also segues straight into, if you manage to invest your employees and your entire organization into the next topic of actually measuring the impact of these initiatives. And I think it's a really interesting point you make in learning metrics about traditional focus on ROI versus measuring the impact of learning.
Yeah.
And do you want to tell me a little bit about your perspective on that?
Oh, Marcus, you just opened a can of worms. This might just take the whole podcast. I'll be gentle here.
And I just want to say this topic it's super hot. So
yeah,
I've seen a lot of discussions around it. So I'm super eager to hear your.
So the reason I qualify this, Marcus, is because a lot of people who sell you on these methodologies have a vested interest. So they're trying to make money off it. Now, here's the deal. Your senior leaders are formally educated in business, right? They went to school like I have, and they specialize in different areas in business. They've learned accounting, finance, and all this wonderful stuff. Now, me as a CPA in Canada, have to follow strict standards and guidelines around accounting and finance. One thing we don't do typically is measure the literal return on investment of a cost center. We can say in a figurative sense, what is the return on learning or return on investment on learning? We can say that figuratively because we're looking at something, what we're getting back from putting money into learning. But there's no true accountability financially for any type of cost center organization. You don't see departments, other cost centers. I'll give you examples. IT, manufacturing, marketing. These are all cost centers, just like learning and development. But nobody's asking a true ROI from them. What they're asking is, if we invest in these businesses, will we get eventual causation or correlation to the improved results of the organization, the performance and the revenue and all this kind of stuff? That's what they're looking for. So when somebody comes out and says, I have a formula for training that I can measure ROI, it's not a credible formula because there is no formula like that in business. So rather than do that, what you need to do is show the accountability not through a financial context. We look in cost centers, we look at it as a cost benefit, right? There's an analysis called cost benefit in finance and accounting. Cost benefit means that it is a cost, but what is the benefit we're receiving out of it? Not an ROI. What's the benefit that's coming out of it that correlates to the rest of the organization? Because as you said, Marcus, we are a supportive group. Like IT, like marketing, we're a support operational role. And so when we put money into that, it's got to show some movement in the improvement in other areas that are driving the revenue or the profits of the organization, right? The profit centers. So if we're looking at, use a simple example like manufacturing, let's say, and this is actually, I'm going to simplify it, but this is actually an example that I went through. A company wanted to reduce its defect rate. I'm going to make up numbers here from 10% down to 5% over the next 12 months. And because there's a lot of customer complaints, a lot of returns, a lot of defects, all this kind of stuff. And so they did analysis and they said, well, there's two things that can affect the defects. And there was either process or people meaning knowledge. And there was a bit of both because process, they had put new equipment in place. And at the time, the supplier didn't actually train the people properly on the use of that equipment. So the company took it upon itself to say, okay, let's revisit how people use the equipment. So what happened is that the organization went back in, did an analysis of what the employees needed to learn, meaning they looked at the current process, benchmarked that, decided where the errors were happening, and decided to create a learning program that was operationalized into the manufacturing process. So in short, what we did is put a real-time learning process in place, as well as these quick, I'll call them e-tutorials or anything like that people could access immediately within 30 seconds if they forgot something on critical areas of the manufacturing process. And so they can access that immediately to get immediate recall. And of course, better retention, better application. When that happened, in short, the defect rate, over the next 6 months dropped from 10 to like 7 or 6%, right? Now, the target was 5 or 4% or something like that. It was like more than half. But just that movement, changing that think about what it means as far as a multinational company on its production when you just move it by 1%, let alone 3 or 4% down. Not only that, the benefits that came out of it. So now we got less defects coming out of the company. So costs come down, waste costs come down, timing and production times increase, meaning, I should say the opposite, come down because they're producing more in less time. Customers are now happier, right? They're getting products that work and they don't have to complain to the company. Customer service metrics have come down significantly because the movement of 2 or 3% down from 10%. So there's this domino effect that just because we did the right training and understood the process, it had a domino effect throughout the organization, causing significant benefits. And you can quantify these financially if you wanted to, but down the road. So the investment in training in that role was minimal to the benefit that it way exceeded what they put into the training. And now, of course, they're doing more of it. So point being is that once you understand the connection of the metrics, because keep in mind, whenever you are focusing on one area to fix as far as learning goes, an organization is a multiple of parts, right? An organization you're not just fixing one area. When you're fixing one area, consequently, you're affecting another area for better or worse. So you have to think about the connections around it of what you're going to do that's going to make the rest of the organization better. And really, that's really where it comes to it. That's why I say get rid of the ROI, because ROI, first of all, we don't measure ROI of cost centers. Number two, the ROI methodologies out there are not credible. They don't exist in the real world. Number three, it's not the actual literal ROI that they're looking for. They're looking for a cost benefit. So keep that in mind. And naturally, when we're looking at an ROI figuratively of learning, we're looking at movement of the key performance indicators, right? Because what we're trying to do overall is improve performance within the organization. So if we look at the right metrics, and don't invent your own metrics in learning, look at the metrics, the performance metrics that actually exist. Every department have metrics, they have performance indicators that they have to meet. And when you engage with that, you can move that needle. But always keep in mind, ROI, the training ROI methodologies that we see isolate training as being the one responsible. And here's the crux of it, Marcus. When you're responsible, when they make you responsible for that, and they're saying, look, the success will be all yours, I say, well, it's a double-edged sword. If you want the success and good for you, but if it goes south and it doesn't work, are you going to accept blame fully? Probably not. And that's the big misconception and mistake here with the training ROI movement, is that they don't recognize that training is part of a larger ecosystem. It's one component in the larger system of an organization. And even though we might be doing the right things, the training might have full impact because other things are impeding it. And we have to look at that. And that's really important when we talk about training ROI. So in short, I'll conclude with this. Training ROI was seen as a quick fix. And in real life, there are no quick fixes, right? If we're all, as human beings, we're all looking for the shortcut and the path of least resistance. But it's not Occam's razor here, the simplest answer. It's actually, there are multiple parts in an organization that we have to figure out what's happening and how we're impacting those elements and making sure that we are not being held accountable solely to it, because we're not solely responsible for everything the organization does. We do have an important role, but we're not just those ones. So I always say, people, be careful when you're using training ROI. I actually tell them, don't use training ROI is what I say.
Interesting. So this is more of a scenario where you actually look at before and then after implementing a learning initiative to really evaluate and understand the impact and the change that you're trying to make in the organization, right?
Yeah, and it's about the metrics exist. Like the funny thing about L&D, people always say, well, where do I find these measures and how do I know I'm making a difference? Well, they're out there. Organizations don't exist in a vacuum. Your senior leaders have cascaded down through an organization all these key performance indicators through some sort of performance scorecard. And so every element of the organization is held accountable to those performance benchmarks. So like in my example of the 10% defect rate, Marcus, if if that department, the manufacturing in this case, is told by their leadership, you need to decrease that by half, that's their key performance metric. So you need to hang your hat on that, right? That's where you're going to prove the figurative return on investment of your learning requirement, the cost benefit, I should say.
So basically, you're saying is connecting L&D to the existing KPIs within your organization to understand the uplift that you may be able to do with the learning initiative, right?
Yeah, and think about the relationships you make. Absolutely, Marcus. And think about relationships you make, because you're speaking the same language as that operational manager, right? That's their preoccupation. That's what keeps them up at night. And you're helping them address that. You're speaking to the senior leadership because that's what they're looking at. But if you start creating your own metrics, like an ROI or something that's learning focused, I hate to say it, I'm going to be very blunt here. They don't give a crap about those learning metrics. It doesn't mean anything. It's irrelevant to them. It might be relevant to you internally, and that's fine, but it's not relevant to them. The only thing that's relevant to them is the performance of the organization, and that's where you need to base your effort on to moving that needle.
And this would also be a way of L&D becoming a business partner within the organization as well.
Yeah, and if I may segue a little bit, it's sort of related to this, Marcus, but you probably have heard this significantly in L&D. They keep saying we're order takers, right? All we become is order takers, just like at McDonald's or whatever, that they take your order. And I'm saying, well, that's not the organization's fault. If I may be so blunt, that's L&D's fault. And that's because if you're seen as an order taker, you're letting another operation dictate what they need in training. So your role should be proactive. I've taken L&D teams on field trips to other operations in the organization and say, hey, we're going to sit here and we're going to be the therapist to this department. We're going to listen to what their concerns are. We're going to dissect what they tell us between the processes and the people. Some of us may not be relevant to L&D, and some of it may be relevant to L&D. But we need to be engaged and proactive and understand their business rather than wait for them to come to us. So change that attitude. Get out there, be proactive, and become part of that culture. Make that learning culture ingrained in the operations. And you'll do that by just getting out of your seat and learning about the business.
Fascinating. And I'm also thinking about something you wrote in the book about retention and application of knowledge. And actually, how can organizations improve the retention and ensure that the knowledge the employees gain apply to what they learn in the day-to-day work?
That's always been a challenge. And what I'm about to say is going to be very general. And I think, I'll qualify this by saying each organization is quite unique in how they approach this. But in short, the word is relevance. When we make it relevant to them, right, it becomes important to the organization. So we're talking about knowledge retention and transition to application. And what we're talking about here, of course, as a lot of L&D people recognize, is the Kirkpatrick's 4 levels, right? And a side note, if you're going to work with the 4 levels, and even Don Kirkpatrick said this, of course, prior to his passing, you should work with the Kirkpatrick model from level 4 to level 1, meaning, as Stephen Covey once said, begin with the end in mind, right? The end in mind is, what is the business objective? What is the business expectation? Right? That's level 4. We have to meet that and then work backwards from there. So level 3 is about application. And when we apply and get them to apply, then they make a difference in the business. But to get them to apply, they have to remember and recall what they've learned, right? So level 1 and 2 is really about the learning part. Level 3 and 4 are really about the operational part. So working backwards, how do we make sure we move from level 2 to level 3? It's relevance. When you make your learning objectives in your design of your learning practical, right? When you make it, so going back to what I said before about what does the employee want and how do they want to improve and how to get vested into it, that should be the starting point of you designing your learning objectives within your courses. And those courses should not only be practical, but should be action-driven and result-driven, right? They should show some endpoint in that learning objective. Now, those learning objectives, if designed properly, will isolate exactly what they need to learn. And then you can decide with them how they should learn it, right? But once you make that relevance connection, they will be focused because not only are they invested into the design of it, they now see the endpoint of what it's going to do for them, right? So that's the retention part. And the more relevant you make it and the more vested you make it for them, the more it's going to stick with them, right? Here's a simple, stupid example, Marcus. I love cars, right? And a lot of young people, when I was young anyways, we all wanted our driver's license, right? And I remember, and in my province in Canada, you could get your learner's permit, your driver's permit at 16 and your learner's permit at 15 and a half. Once you turn 15 and a half, you could get your learner's permit. And the day I turned 15 and a half, I dragged my father to permit. Now he started teaching me. Because it was so relevant to me that I wanted to drive, I retained everything he said. Then he put me into a course and I soaked up everything that the instructor told me. Because I didn't want to fail that test when I went to write it when I turned 16 years old. On the day after I turned 16 years old, I had an appointment to get my driver's permit. I remembered everything and I passed this test successfully. I wasn't smarter than anybody else, but I blew those tests away. Even the driving instructor, I remember this vividly at 16 years old, told me, he goes, wow, you drive exceptionally well. He took me on a half-hour drive or 45-minute drive. And he says, you know how to parallel park, you know how to do this, because I retained and I practiced everything I did because it was so relevant to me and so key to my desire to want to drive this car that I retained it and I practiced it when I applied it. And it ended up to my ultimate objective, which was driving the car independently, which speaks to level 4, driving the car independently, level 3, the application of the skill, and level 2, the relevance of the learning that I'm retaining, right? Now, I use a simple example because when people are really engaged, they will not only remember, but they will want to practice it. And you can do this if you want to make those learning objectives actionable in a vacuum. You create environments where they can practice that role. So if you're training them in reducing defects, well, you go take them to the machinery in an isolated environment where it's not affecting production to practice this over and over again, right? So not only are they retaining, but they're applying it at the same time, right? You can do role plays, you can do case examples, you can do a lot of different things to make them relevant. And if they're bought into it, they will leave your training session wanting to apply it, right? And the more they apply it, the more it becomes a habit. But not only that, you should also have an ecosystem around them that supports things if they forget it, right? Because it's easy to forget things in the pressure of the moment. And so when they're able to access the knowledge very quickly and then apply it, it changes everything.
So basically, the KPIs in the business, they trickle down to the team level, but they also trickle down to the individual contributor.
When done well, yes. I speak to the names of leading organizations in the world, and I guarantee you they've trickled it down as low as possible, from the senior corporate to individual, as close as possible. So they know, each employee knows what their expectations are. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that Starbucks, to a certain extent, has some key metrics around their baristas. And I'm guessing, and maybe somebody will prove me wrong here in this podcast, but I hope I'm not, because they do. I'm not a fan. I'm not a cheerleader for Starbucks. I just want to say that I do like Starbucks, but I'm not a cheerleader. But I am impressed when I see things in business operate so well. And so I can, just by intuition, I can see them doing this so well and executing their production, their productivity and their production so well that they have to bring it down to that level. So their baristas know what they need to do. So, in short, that's my intuition. But again, I could be completely wrong, Marcus.
So in this case, we're talking about a learning organization who probably rolled out an initiative, and they are able to evaluate it because they've seen the changes in the KPIs over time, right?
Yeah.
But if you're in a situation where you're a new L&D leader within a company and you want to drive the project and be the one who initiates the learning initiative within this company, where do you start then? Because that's going to be a different story, right?
Yeah, and I know we had a couple of casual conversations about this, Marcus, and it's about building a business case, right? I know, when I go to trade shows or learning conferences, I go to the trade show and all these L&D people are fascinated by the new technology. And the people that I do encounter sometimes, I have to remind them that when you're doing this, you have to make sure that before you pitch that you want to buy this product or whatever technology, you need to build a proper business case to convince the stakeholder. And that's not just you. It's nothing personal. It's all business, right? Because your stakeholders have a limited amount of resources, and I don't care what scale the company is. I don't care if you're Apple with trillions of dollars or you're, a small startup with, 100 employees. You have sufficient budget to allocate appropriately to drive value for the organization for the scale you're at. So they have to be judicious in their allocation of those funds where it's going to drive the most value. And they're only going to see that if you build a proper business case. Now, what's interesting here is building a business case for a learning initiative is twofold. One is the learning side, which you're the subject expert, and so you should be able to build a proper business case. And if you follow what I talk about here in building that learning business case, you're going to look at the key performance indicators and the areas that you've talked to, the operational areas that you've talked to build how you're going to make sure the learning is going to take place and engage that department and improve those KPIs. That's the learning case. But there's another part of the business case that we often leave out when we pitch to business leaders for the money. And that's one, you need to get the financial end sorted out. And you need to, these days, of course, most of learning has some technology incorporated into it. And I say e-learning as an umbrella, meaning it could be any type of e-learning technology, meaning from courses to software to LMSs to whatever, right? That's all the E part. And when we talk about the E part, for your senior leaders, as soon as you put e-learning in anything, you see E as an electronic delivery system for learning. They see the E as efficiency and effectiveness, right? That's why they put money in IT, because the IT is to make their business more productive. They just don't buy computers for the sake of buying computers. They buy computers because the E part in computers is to make the companies more efficient and more seamless, right? So the E for them is about efficiency. So as soon as you say e-learning in any form, that's where their mind goes to. So number one, you need to understand that. Number two, you need to sort out the money of how you're going to finance this within the organization, why you need the money, and how are you going to use it. And of course, the third most important is getting your IT department involved, because they're the ones going to be supporting all of the e-technology that you put into the learning part. So these three things, the finance, the IT, and the learning component have to come together in a proper business case. So don't do this by yourself. You got the learning strategy down. That's fine. Connect it to operational strategy. The finance, you go find people in finance to sit down with you and say, okay, I want to invest in this LMS. It's going to cost a few $100,000 to put it company-wide, right? And now you have to build a business case why in the learning component, why you need the LMS, right? But the financing part, you can sit with them, because that, by the way, is a literal ROI, because it's an investment in capital assets or actual tangible investments in the company. And that has to be calculated based on a true accounting ROI, okay? And then, of course, you need the IT people to buy in to see how it will fit into the company without disrupting the current IT infrastructure, and that they can support the technology. Because these are all the questions that are going to come to you when you build that business case, okay? And so when you build that business case, you have now a solid foundation to challenge them to say, yes to your proposal. Because when they say no, it's really not a true no. When they reject you at first, it's more like, convince me, is really what they're telling me. You're not giving me something that I can be convinced about. So you need to make sure that you talk to those leaders making the decisions. You need to talk to the operational leaders that are going to be affected by it, right, to build that business case. You need to talk to finance to see how you're going to manage the funds and where you're going to get it and how you're going to use it. You need to talk to IT to make sure they can support the technology and it will fit seamlessly into your organization without disrupting a lot of the other elements. So, and you need to make sure that if you're going to put any E in your business learning proposals or initiatives, that it makes the company more efficient or more effective. And so this is the crux of a business case. And if you don't do that, I guarantee you'll be shot down because they won't see value in your proposal and they'll take their funds and they'll place it elsewhere where it's going to drive value. And that's really the short of it. I know it sounds complicated and involved, but look, I know how they think. I won't say I know how everybody thinks, but I know I have a sense of how business leaders look at things. And being in that role myself for a number of years prior and working with senior leaders quite often, I see their focus and they know what they're doing. And it's not they don't see value in learning. They actually see value in learning. If they don't see value in learning, it's because you're not delivering the value that they want to see. And that's really the crux of it. We have to look at ourselves in the mirror before we decide that. But that's really, Marcus, where building a business case of a learning initiative is key and how we want to do it.
I love that. And fantastic insights. And today's conversation has really been a real eye-opener for me when it comes to rethinking the ROI in learning. And it challenges the traditional focus and offers a fresh perspective on how we truly can measure the impact of L&D. And I also really enjoy that we touched upon the learning metrics and the importance of aligning L&D team with the business outcomes. And of course, in the last pieces here, talking about how L&D can become a real business partner within the organization. Tremendously valuable information. And thank you so much for sharing it, Ajay. I'm sure our listeners are walking away with plenty to think about this moment.
Well,
but before we close, is there anything else you'd like to add or leave to our listeners?
No, I know this can be overwhelming, and don't get me wrong, I understand that. And I'm not trying to make L&D business experts or operational experts or financial experts. That's not your role. Okay, let's be clear. Your role is a subject expert in learning and development. That's what you're hired for. But there's one saying that I think I shared with you, Marcus, is that I always remind L&D people that, and you can replace the word business with operations, but what I'm about to say, but you're a business function within a business expected to deliver business results. What does that mean? It means that you have a responsibility to become business literate, right? So it's nice to be an expert in learning. And people in marketing are experts in marketing. People in finance and accounting are experts in finance and accounting, and so forth within an organization. But all of those areas are also, they know how to fit into the business and what they're expected to deliver. What learning needs to learn themselves is, what is my role in becoming accountable for the business and delivering value? And that's really important, because I know in all the organizations I've worked with, and they've been some very significant names in this industry, I've never seen them cut their budgets. These companies actually invested more in downtimes because their L&D department is not an afterthought. It's a fully integrated, involved operational activity within the organization that works together with the rest of the operations and becomes a fabric and cultural element to your organization. So next time your budget is cut or reduced, ask yourself, why would they reduce it? Why wasn't I showing value? And maybe have the courage to go ask them, why did you cut my budget and where do you believe I wasn't adding value? Ask that question, and that may turn things around.
Yeah, that's a very good lesson for anyone involved in a business, I think. Thank you again, Ajay, for sharing your expertise today. And for those of you listening and watching, you can find more about Ajay, including his book, Learning Metrics, and his articles on Learnster.com or in the link in the description below. And be sure to connect with Ajay and keep exploring his great resources. Thank you so much, Ajay.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for bearing and listening to me today. I appreciate that as well.
Yes, and thank you very much for listening as well. Don't forget to share your feedback with me and let me know who you'd like to see on the show in the future. And tune into our upcoming episodes visiting Learnster.com. Remember to stay curious, keep learning, and as always, stay hungry for knowledge.